You're listening to NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Faculty of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw. My name is Maria Usakowska. If you've ever read a novel by Cormac McCarthy, after finishing it, it probably stayed with you for a longer time. It might have been because of his original writing style, the graphic descriptions of violence, or the questions about good and evil that he asks. Today's guest, Professor Steven Frye, is here to explain why McCarthy's novels have such a huge impact on their readers and how McCarthy, underneath the adventurous Western plots and settings, is a deeply philosophical writer. Professor Frye is department chair and professor of English in the Department of English at California State University, Bakersfield. He's a renowned scholar of American literature, more specifically the American Romance tradition, and literature of the American West. He received the 2019 California State University Bakersfield Award for Outstanding Research, Scholarship, and Creative Activity. He's the author of several books on Cormac McCarthy, and he's also president of the Cormac McCarthy Society. Professor Frye visited our faculty in November and taught a course on the birth of environmental consciousness in American literature, a topic that we also explore today. Please enjoy my conversation with Professor Frye, who was kind enough to share bits of his knowledge with me. Professor Steven Frye, welcome to NeoTalk.
Thank you for having me.
So you've come to Warsaw to teach a very interesting course on American Renaissance and the birth of environmental consciousness. And I think we should discuss this topic as well at some point. However, I would like to start this conversation with what seems to be your main topic of interest, and that is the work of the unfortunately recently deceased writer Cormac McCarthy, who is considered by many one of the most important American writers of the 20th century. And in your book, Understanding Cormac McCarthy, you write that his novels are uniquely American in their form and themes. And I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by that?
Well, a lot of things. First of all, the most obvious thing is that they're American in terms of their setting, particularly those that are set in the South and those that are set in the West. And those settings are distinctive. They're distinctively American. They're distinctively and culturally identified by region. And that's certainly one feature and the most obvious feature that makes him an American writer. But the other thing might be his emphasis in some of his novels on challenging certain fundamentally American myths, particularly the West and the South, those kinds of mythic figures that emerged out of a uniquely American tradition. And finally, there is a strong emphasis on work, which is a common theme in the American novel. We see it in Hemingway, we see it in Faulkner, we see it especially in Melville. So all those things really, I think, mark him out in many ways as American, but in being uniquely American, he is not so identifiable as an American that he isn't preoccupied with, and I would call him one of the most important authors of world literature in the 20th century, even though he is distinctly American. In terms of form, his novels embrace a certain kind of, and it's not really distinctly American, but he's marked with the legacy of modernism in terms of his use of different kinds of narrative conventions and styles and interlaced narrative strands, and he never uses specifically a stream of consciousness narrative technique like Faulkner does, for example, but he does employ some of the stylistic devices and lyrical devices that you associate with that narrative technique and genre.
I think that's one of the things that make him a little bit unconventional, right? There's this writing style and sometimes lack of traditional punctuation, elements like that. Do you think it's because he is inspired by writers like Faulkner in that sense?
Yeah, I do. And I think that in his early work, he was really sort of seen as William Faulkner's kind of heir apparent. He actually was edited initially by Albert Erskine, who was Faulkner's editor. And so there is a sense in which Erskine was sort of seeking out the new late 20th century Faulkner. He ends up transcending that influence in a significant way, and Faulkner is one of his favorites in terms of influences, but his favorite is Melville. Melville and secondarily Dostoevsky. So there's a rich range of influences that are threading their way through his works. And stylistically, there's also a blend of Shakespearean cadences, Jacobean cadences. So the King James Bible is very much influencing how he writes. And he's just very interested in orchestrating prose in a very lyrical and poetic way.
I think you said something at your lecture here at the University of Warsaw, and I think you were quoting McCarthy, something about how any novel that is written contains the tradition in itself. The novel doesn't exist in a void, basically. It does exist in a tradition, and it has to allude to the past.
Absolutely. He says in his first interview with Woodward, he says that the ugly fact is that books are made out of books. The novel takes its life from the books that have been written. Now, the way I think about that is I like to characterize him as T.S. Eliot's traditional author. And in his famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, what Eliot talks about, and he associates tradition with innovation. He doesn't make them opposites. The idea is to be innovative, one must be traditional in a very unique sense. And what he says is that the traditional author, therefore the new and innovative author, has what he calls historical sense. In other words, and he uses these words, he says that he lives with the past and past authors. He or she lives with the past authors in his bones, right? But the second idea that Eliot introduces is the idea that the tradition is organic, meaning that the addition of a new work to the tradition is not like putting a brick on a structure. It's like a branch growing out of a tree. It's organic. In other words, when a new work enters, we can't read the works that have influenced it in the same way. So for Eliot, for example, in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he makes reference to Hamlet. And he contextualizes Hamlet in reference to his main character, Prufrock. It becomes difficult, arguably, to go back and read Shakespeare's Hamlet in the same way. In other words, effectively, Eliot has changed our reading of Hamlet. And I think with McCarthy, we can see that, and I've experienced myself, the idea that after reading McCarthy, I don't read Faulkner the same way, and I certainly don't read Melville the same way. He has changed them for me. And McCarthy's claim is you can't be an effective writer unless you have imbibed that tradition into yourself and into your writing.
I think another problem is that we're also reading this in a different historical moment. Things have happened since that oeuvre was published. So
yeah, that's certainly true.
I think in order to talk about McCarthy's work, we have to mention the American frontier and the frontier romance, because he clearly uses that convention, right? So for context for our listeners, could you please explain what these concepts mean and how they are important in the tradition of the American novel?
Well, sure. The romance, really, when the novel emerged as a genre in the 18th century, it very quickly bifurcated into two general strands. One we associate with the novel of dense social texture, what we conventionally call novels. They don't have any subtitle except novel. So, interestingly, we would place novels like those of Jane Austen or even George Eliot in the tradition of the novel. But the bifurcation into the romance involves two things. One, the use of the novel form to re-embody the epic of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So you get the works of Sir Walter Scott, and in America you get the works of James Fenimore Cooper and William Gilmore Simms, right? So they're mythic in nature, they're representative in nature. And the other strand of the romance is really novels that are overtly preoccupied with philosophical questions outside of a dense social context. And in that, the most dominant subgenre is the Gothic. Right. So what we see going on in McCarthy, for example, is a blend, right? We certainly see him engaging those myths and those general patterns. We also see him engaging deep philosophical questions. In the tradition of James Fenimore Cooper, he embodies the epic, right? So in Blood Meridian especially, we have an inversion of that frontier romance, which takes the basic mythic conventions of the ancient Greeks and Romans and places them in the American West, initially in the Alleghenies and the Appalachian Mountains and the frontiers of New York in James Fenimore Cooper. So the frontier becomes this powerful and fascinating space where America sort of tests and evaluates what its emerging values are. And what's interesting about that frontier romance, and I would have to credit Richard Slotkin in Regeneration Through Violence for this, his well-known book, in that he says that American heroes are distinctive. Our heroes, we admire people like our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and others, John Adams, etc. But they're not our heroes. Our heroes are land boomers, frontiersmen, Indian fighters, right? And you see that in our tradition all the way up until today. So it's those frontiersmen and through those figures that we're working out our sense of national identity.
And also, as far as I understand, the frontier itself is very important for the American identity, right? Or the American myth.
Right.
Could you explain maybe to our listeners who are not very interested in the American history what the frontier actually is?
Well, that's a very contested topic, especially today. So the American idea of the frontier as a shaping force was originally posited by Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893. And he wrote a lecture where he dealt with that. It's called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. What he posited was and defined the frontier as an empty space of free available land. And he said that is the thing that motivated the development of America, the existence of that space. What we now, of course, understand today is that it wasn't an unoccupied space, that it required rapacious conquest and lots of conflict. So that's where we take Turner to task. But there's zero question, and we see it in all of our mythological narratives. We see it even in science fiction films like Star Trek, where the frontier is an idea that motivates. And there is a sense that whether the reality of the frontier was that it shaped American history, we certainly think it did. And we center so many of our stories in either an actual or a sort of imagined frontier space.
As far as I understand, also this revision of the idea of the frontier right now that you've mentioned is also in a way connected to the genre of the revisionist Western, right? Because we are overturning some stereotypes of the American West and how it was conquered, and we're changing the narrative, right? And I think you've mentioned that McCarthy also does that in a way, right? He takes this genre of the Western and he makes something a little bit different out of it.
One of the things that we would say about the Western is, and I call it the American morality play. And that is, it is the mythic space and the mythic genre where Americans have always sort of sorted out their sense of themselves, their ideological convictions, their values, etc. And that goes all the way back to James Fenimore Cooper and before. And so as we change, our myths change. And they don't necessarily change by inventing new genre, although they can. The genre that has embodied our myth, primarily the frontier romance that emerged into the Western, changes its own internal structure and internal values. I'll credit Richard Slotkin again. The third volume in his Frontier trilogy is called Gunfighter Nation, where he treats the Western specifically. And what he notes is that after World War II, and even before, the Western was what he called progressive, and what he meant was conservative and nationalistic. Okay, meaning the embrace of American progress, right, in that mythic sense. So you had characters who were violent and were brutal, but they were rendered in such a way that we respect them and we like them and we want to be like them. The John Wayne figure, the character, and that's not his name is Marion Morrison. So the John Wayne character that transcends his individual films becomes an embodiment of that positive myth of the West. And we can see how that would happen coming out of a war, a conflict where we suffered in America, but nothing like you suffered in Europe. And so we could sort of be very proud of ourselves. Right? We weren't rebuilding our cities, right? And it makes sense. And then the Vietnam War hits. and the civil rights movement hit. And people begin to question that optative, democratic, progressivist sense of what America is. Our sense of nationalism is rendered problematic, and the Western changes. The Western hero emerges first in the Italian director Sergio Leone through the figure of Clint Eastwood, but even before in the films of Sam Peckinpah, for example. You start to get the heroes that are self-serving. They're not serving others. They're excessively brutal and not always admirable, kind of anti-heroic. We see that in many of Sam Peckinpah's films. We see that in the novels of Larry McMurtry later, and certainly Cormac McCarthy. We see it in all the films that the Westerns that Clint Eastwood made. You have this dark, anti-mythic sort of figure. So McCarthy is in Blood Meridian especially, but even in the Border trilogy certainly, is trying to work underneath that myth, not necessarily from a politically liberal, say, perspective, but from the perspective of a hard, unflinching realist who wants to challenge the myth and show its dark undercurrents. And again, he does it by using the Western. And Blood Meridian, he just called it, while he was writing it, he would refer to it as his Western. So he's very aware, I think, of this revisionist impulse.
So if the Western expresses what America thinks of itself, right? Mm-hmm. What does McCarthy's Western say about his contemporary America?
Well, it's very complicated, right?
Of course.
Yeah. And first of all, he pretty clearly wants to challenge the idea that the space that we call the frontier, and remember the novel is set in 1849, that the space we refer to or think of as the frontier was previously occupied, but it was not previously occupied by a beneficent, benign, peaceful people. He's very, very careful to render Native Americans as richly complex. The Comanche are brutal, as are the Apache, but many of the other tribal entities that he encounters are very peaceful. So he's not revising the Western in the direction of a different politics so much as he's revising the Western to undercut and move us out of or to scrutinize the myth in a realist context. And so it's a deeply and well-researched novel. So in that context, that's what he's doing. And he's not overtly political in any specific way. But part of what he wants to point to is that the West was a space, like a lot of spaces in the world, of unremitting violence. That's a characteristic of American history, but for McCarthy, it's characteristic of the world.
We will definitely come back to the topic of violence because I think that's inevitable when it comes to McCarthy. But I first want to ask you about something a little bit different because you write that McCarthy is ultimately a philosophical writer. Mm-hmm. And I've read that he was once described by Robert Coles in The New Yorker as a novelist of religious feeling. However, it seems that he does not really stick to one particular religion, like, for example, Dostoevsky, who operates within this Christian framework, right? So in your research, do you see whether McCarthy engages in any particular philosophy or religion?
He engages in many. Mm-hmm. In many things that I've written, I have frequently called him God-haunted. Robert Coles is exactly right. And I like his phrasing, religious feeling, because so much of it is a felt sense in McCarthy. He's broadly in a Western. I don't see him engaging Eastern religions in any particular way, although I could be convinced if someone were to explore that. But what he does is I would call him religiously interested, a writer of religious feeling, God-haunted, but also religiously heterodox, not orthodox. In other words, he is interested in the experience of religion. He has said in an interview that he has great respect for the spiritual view of life, particularly its ethical dimensions, right? That he wants to be a better person and somehow that is linked to spirituality. He directly engages existential Christianity, Christianity broadly. He also clearly engages Gnosticism. He explores that alternative metaphysics. He's very interested in Platonism and its religious implications, especially in his last two novels, that is The Passenger and Stella Maris, but also previously. So yeah, I think that he's heterodox. I like to say that he is apostate to all enclosing concepts. Right? He will not be limited by any of them. He was raised a Catholic, and many people see a certain, in his use of imagery, particularly sacramental imagery throughout, most very notable in The Road, very notable in Suttree, but elsewhere, even just some of his styles are influenced by a certain kind of ornate aesthetics that we associate with Catholicism. But he was not a practicing Catholic and can't be pinned down in terms of a specific religion. I think that's part of what enriches him as a religious writer, is that he's not one kind of religious writer. He's fascinated with many.
And also he asks a lot of philosophical questions, right? About good and evil, but also about generally the meaning of life.
Yeah.
So he asks these questions, but do we get any answers from his novels, do you think?
Well, yes and no. In other words, what I would say is we get many answers, yet none of them are definitive. They are definitive in the moment that he's writing them. And we could talk, for example, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about The Road, and so I'll pause and not talk about that too much. But we certainly get a rendering of a certain religious perspective there. But it's not consistent throughout his work. Again, the Gnostic voice in Blood Meridian is very clear.
Could you explain this concept, Gnosticism, because I don't think it's that obvious?
Oh, sure. Well, Gnosticism is an ancient Near Eastern religious system that pre-existed Christianity and then coexisted along with it. And the metaphysics of Gnosticism was basically built around the idea that the world is controlled by a almost demonic entity that Gnostics called a demiurge. And serving the demiurge are lesser deities called archons. And the world we live in has trapped pieces of divine substance, the ultimate good, but the world is dominated by evil. And the way we get out of that is to seek gnosis or knowledge, right? But Gnosticism explains something of why the world would be so violent, even as we try to imagine an ultimate divinity that is good. And that is that for a time at least, that good is not present with us. It is outside our world. And the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, they emerged in the 1950s, and all of a sudden we became fascinated with this ancient Near Eastern philosophy. So that's basically it. And we see it in Blood Meridian in the figure of the judge, who can be read as a kind of demiurge, right? He's got a supernatural quality to him. He's seen everywhere like the white whale. He seems to be able to triumph over almost anything. He's dancing in the end. And so he's been read as that Gnostic figure. But McCarthy is very careful in the novel to say that he cannot be reduced to any single system. So he warns us, don't read him one way, that is the judge. But yeah, that's Gnosticism.
Of course, when you're saying the white whale, you're alluding to Herman Melville's Moby Dick, right?
Absolutely.
And do you have any, I mean, of course you do, but the dancing that you've mentioned, is this a certain answer that McCarthy is trying to give us symbolically?
Well, remember, it's the judge who's dancing. This, let's just say, horrifically problematic figure. The dance, in my reading of it, that the judge does in the end is a dance that implies a kind of harmony built on violence. So it is, again, the Gnostic reading works there, but other naturalistic readings might work there, other ways of reading the world. The judge's philosophy that war is God, that war is an ordering principle, is, I think, symbolically manifest in the harmony implied by the dance, which is its own kind of order.
Yeah, I think we need to talk about violence. You mentioned that Blood Meridian is your favorite book of McCarthy. It is full of violence. It's gut-wrenching sometimes, seems almost over the top. However, it's also, I think we need to distinguish it from, for example, the gore that we can find in like horror movies, right? It's not a fetishization. Why is it there then? Because I also understand that it is a certain aesthetic choice.
Right. Part of the issue of violence in Blood Meridian in particular, and I'll speak to some of his other works as well, because it's throughout his works, boils down, whether or not it is excessive or not. Harold Bloom said he put the novel down a couple of times before he was even able to get through it. So any challenge to McCarthy on the reality of the violence in Blood Meridian is a very legitimate challenge. And it sort of depends upon the individual reader as to whether or not it's excessive or not. In reality, it is not excessive. In other words, it's based on historical events. They happened, and he renders them vividly. And the Glanton Gang did those things, and it's based upon those actual events. So it sort of depends on your aesthetic values. How much truth do you tell when you're rendering something? How much responsibility do you have, right? I would argue that the films, for example, and Blood Meridian as a novel fits into this category. You'll notice that violence in war films really, and that is the explicit representation of violence in war films, emerged in the late 1960s and in the 1970s in the context of Vietnam. In other words, arguably what is underneath them is an abhorrence of war and a desire not to celebrate it. So you could argue that to soften the violence in Blood Meridian is to soften the reality and the ethical abhorrence that we have for those events. But, I leave it to people who, there's also certain things that each of us, have difficulty handling. I'm not a horror film fan, interestingly enough. Maybe I'm a little superstitious, but I don't get disturbed by violence in film in the same way. And I think we have to respect everyone. If someone says, I can't read Blood Meridian, I completely understand it.
Personally, for some reason, I think it is the violent books that stay with me for a longer time than the film images. I think from a psychological point of view, I would say that it's maybe because it's when I'm reading, it's my own mind that produces those images, and they are in a way stronger, because they come also from me. But also speaking of that darkness and, we're trying to find a meaning, I think. And I think you're right that it is in this darkness that it is possible to find meaning and value. And for me, when I was reading your texts, I think it was a little bit hard to accept that in these really unsettling, extremely dark images, we are supposed to find something meaningful, and we're supposed to find an answer to the question of the meaning of life, because I think the optimist in me maybe wants the meaning of life to be something on the side of the light, I would say, not on the side of the darkness. But I guess it's a certain philosophy that McCarthy has, right? We don't have to agree with him, I guess.
No, we don't. Well, what I would say, first of all, and I'll refer to any number of his books in this context, that McCarthy doesn't render anything that doesn't exist in the world. So in his second novel, Outer Dark, you have incest that occurs. That exists in the world. In his third novel, you have necrophilia. That exists in the world. You have a group of bereft, drunken drifters in Suttree. That exists in the world. The events in Blood Meridian happened in actual history. And certainly the cataclysm of the road is something we're all acknowledging increasingly is a potential out there that we would all acknowledge. So I think that what McCarthy would say, and I would very much agree with him, is that most of us are isolated from these kinds of events, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so if we constitute hope outside the context of those events in our own safe space, right, I would argue, and he would argue, that we're constituting hope on the cheap. That if you want a resilient, stalwart hope, you have to go to those places and see if you can find it there. And my argument, and of course, if you can't, you can't, but my argument is he does so frequently find it. So you have this community of urban drifters in Suttree that become a community, and they care for one another. And that capacity for human connection is there. You see the kids' rebellion, which I read, and the judge reads as a legitimate rebellion. He says, you alone were mutinous in that you held in your heart some corner of clemency for the heathen. So the kid resists, and that moral resistance is possible. As you move on into the Border trilogy, you see the heroism and the love that takes place between John Grady Cole and his friends. And finally, in The Road, you have the father and the son who are bound together. That's why that novel makes us weep. And everybody's reaction seems almost the same. So you have this capacity for love. In The Crossing, you have this community that our main character meets, and he talks very explicitly about their communion and their brotherhood and their care for one another. All of that in the context of this violence. And finally, you have the intimation of religious possibility. The father says he knew only that the child was his warrant. If he is not the word of God, God never spoke. Right? So I would say in community, in love, in religious intimation, all of that is where I ground my argument, what I call in my latest book, his geography of hope. But the argument is that's where you get a stalwart hope. You have to find it in that place, because if you find it, in a cafe with your friends where violence is thousands of miles away, okay, but that's a little easy.
Right. Yeah, you basically answered my next question, because I wanted to ask about that hope. And because otherwise, if it wasn't for that hope, I think we could just easily accuse him of nihilism, right? Mm-hmm. He would just be a nihilistic author who just writes about the sins of humanity and how the world is basically doomed, right? Also in that moral sense.
To be fair, there are schools of thought on McCarthy. I'm the one you're talking to, but I think it's safe to say that my perspectives, and I'm not the only one that has it. I'm not the only one that's articulating this argument about hope and possibility and meaning, but it's the most dominant perspective among McCarthy scholars now. But the first book that came out was by Vereen Bell, called The Achievement of Cormac McCarthy in 1985, I believe it was. And he argued that McCarthy was a nihilist. Stephen Shaviro argued that he's a nihilist. My own best friend, who doesn't think McCarthy is a nihilist now, hadn't read McCarthy. He's a provost at University of North Carolina, but we were sharing a hotel room, and he was reading Blood Meridian for the first time in preparation to listen to my talk. He closed it up and said, "That's the most nihilistic book I've ever read." Right. So it's a reasonable reading, but anyone who reads it that way, I would want to talk to them. I would want to explain to them why I think he pushes back against that.
Also, because if we consider this idea of hope and religion, I think it renders McCarthy more interesting, right? I think there's a lot of nihilistic literature out there. Yeah. And it's, in a way, I don't want to say that it's very easy to write this kind of literature, but certainly easier than asking deep philosophical questions, right? Yeah. I was kind of wondering, because I read a little bit about McCarthy's life, and it seemed to me pretty ordinary in a way, apart from the fact that he became very, very famous at some point in his 50s, right? But maybe you, as an expert on him, do you maybe see where all this darkness could have come from?
Well, I would only be able to answer speculatively, right, because a lot of it has to do with the recesses of an individual personality. But McCarthy said that when he was a child in school, that he had every hobby there was. And other people didn't have them, but everything interested him. And you can see as he grew up that one of the things that interested him was reading, which is one of our only ways of encountering the world. And in his reading, he was necessarily exposed to the truth of the world, and that is that there is violence and brutality and death and all those things, and there is love and decency and goodness, and they are constantly in conflict. So I think it's not born out of his experience per se, but except insofar as he's a seeker. And that's the world that he confronted. Not a world that's defined by violence. That would be the judge's perspective. But a world that is imbued with it as it stands in conflict with moral machinery, ethical perspectives, and decent people.
Just this morning, I read James Baldwin's
essay, Everybody's Protest Novel. And in it, he talks about the truth. And basically, he says that the truth is the complexity, right? And the complexity of humans. So basically what you're talking about.
Right.
Of course, I want to talk about The Road because it's, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, but also I think it's one of his most popular. And as many people, it's a book that impacted me emotionally very much. Maybe also because I read it right at the start of the pandemic. So I think it was probably one of the worst possible moments to read it. But, well, here I was. It's crushing at times. I would say for those who haven't read this novel, I would also describe it as a novel where actually there's not a lot of events, not much happens, but there are certain images, and I would say that there are like 2 or 3 scenes in this novel that are incredibly disturbing. And I think they're even stronger because they are perceived through a young child's eyes, right? But as we've mentioned here, it's an important read for many people. Why do you think that is?
Well, because he is in a very, very simple, and I mean that in the best sense, in a very simple way, placing an almost transcendent love that becomes material in the Father and the Son. And he's placing that up against the possibility of world annihilation, and what in the end does that all mean? Right? So violence in The Road, as it confronts this redemptive possibility, is not simply the violence of the cannibals as they attack people. It's the violence of whatever happened to the world. And we don't know. We don't know if it was a striking of a meteor or if it was some sort of atomic blast or some other kind of environmental disaster. We know it happened in an instant, right? That's all we know. But I think it's compelling to us because we know about this potential. We know about our potential for both positive and negative reactions to our experience. And it brings us all to a very existential space where we say to ourselves, who am I? And what ethical path do I want to follow? Because violence does not necessarily have to be the kind of horrific violence we encounter in his work. We can be violent in minor ways, in any way that we hurt someone. And it brings up those fundamentally ethical questions about what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to interact with others? And what kind of sacrifices am I willing to make?
We've talked about hope, right? So where do you think hope lies in The Road? In
The Road. Well, first of all, it lies in the fact that the man and the boy can have this reaction to each other, this love for each other. But I think that ultimately your question about religious feeling is The Road is deceptively complex, or deceptively deep, not so much complex. And that is that I read it as McCarthy, for the moment, toying with a kind of existential Christianity. In other words, God is not out there somewhere while we are here. God is embedded in the love of the Father and the Son. This becomes evidenced in 2 places where the Father refers to the boy as the Word of God and a golden chalice. And also at the conclusion of the novel, when the man, spoiler warning, is dying, and the boy really, how can we imagine any hope for the boy? And the man says, you have to talk to me and you will hear my voice. And we could associate that with memory, right? But at the same time, when he talks to him later, it very clearly becomes a form of prayer. So there is this religious possibility built in there. And originally, folks were reading the landscape as a kind of metaphor for a cosmological void. In other words, they were reading it in an atheistic direction. But I don't read it that way, and I think a lot of people don't read it that way, that the landscape is in fact a wilderness. It's a wilderness that is typological in nature. It goes back to the book of Exodus. It goes to the point at when Christ goes out into the wilderness and is tested by Satan. So it's a place of spiritual testing. And it's a test that they pass. And they pass it because the man responds to the boy's desire to be kind to others, even though it goes against every instinct he has to survive. And ultimately, the boy does find a home. Where that will ultimately lead is a vexing question.
Yeah, the last word in this book is mystery.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
You've mentioned this, but I wanted to talk about the surroundings in this novel because, as we know, the landscape there is completely empty. Nature is dead. There are no sounds also, I think. There's silence. And it's a hostile environment because in it, life has to be sustained completely artificially, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing grows. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you mentioned that you don't think that the landscape is a metaphor, right? Did I understand correctly?
Well, no, I don't think it's a simple metaphor. I think it's an elaborate, figurative rendering of a typological landscape.
What does that mean?
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah, typological landscape, really, it's typology is a method for reading the meaning into and creating coherence in the biblical text. It's a medieval practice. The idea is that the American Puritans looked at the Exodus, that is the movement from Egypt into the wilderness and finally to the Promised Land, as a pattern. And that pattern was reflected, as it happened over 40 years, in an antitype in the New Testament, where Christ goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, where he is tested. And originally, the American Puritans saw their movement here as a further antitype, a developmental antitype into their own experience. They were like the Israelites. So this typology is a way not only of reading the Bible and seeing its pattern and its coherence, but of reading our own experience. And so if we read the road typologically, we read that landscape as a place of spiritual testing that will ultimately, if you pass the test, lead to a kind of delivery. And that's the pattern that takes place in the road.
Do you think it's also quite literal warning about the climate crisis?
I absolutely do. Or it's not only a warning about the climate crisis, but it's a warning about our propensity to violence and our potential for using it in terms of a nuclear disaster. The literal possibilities that he presents us with is either a meteor or an atomic bomb. So what happened didn't happen because of climate change in the novel, but the landscape we experience could be or could happen alternatively from that. You know, McCarthy was a resident and a fellow at the Santa Fe Institute for 25 years and was still in Santa Fe when he died. And he wrote their mission statement. And in it, as he's inviting people to submit proposals, he says, we don't typically engage in political activity, but if you're interested in things such as sustainability, we invite your proposals. So clearly he is concerned with those things. He was also a very good friend of the environmentalist writer Edward Abbey. So I think there's zero question. He would follow the science, he would see what the science is saying about the climate, and he would see this as our potential, one way that we might potentially destroy ourselves.
I also remember reading about him that he was a very science-oriented writer. Mm-hmm. He also hung out a lot with scientists. Mm-hmm. And I think I want to continue a little bit in this direction of the landscape and the, let's say, environmental consciousness, right? Because as we were talking about the American frontier, we've mentioned how the wilderness was very important to the American myth. And McCarthy comes from a tradition of writers, but I think what we call the environmental consciousness is something that is relatively new. However, you have taught a course here, by the way, at the University of Warsaw about this consciousness coming from actually 19th century literature, right? It is something that we can trace back to the works of such authors like Thoreau or Dickinson or Poe. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. That's the basis of what I argue and claim in my course. And I think it's fairly clear that if you read Emerson's Nature, you read Thoreau's Walden, or any number of other works, what we have are the American transcendentalists. And their basic idea is that they're sort of radical Unitarians, meaning that they don't believe in a personal God in precisely the same sense that the Orthodox Christian tradition does, but they believe in a thing called an oversoul that embodies and imbues nature. And since we are a part of nature, we have a piece of that soul within us. right? And so you see them talking about nature, its value, its divinity, and you see them already beginning to respond to the Industrial Revolution. Particularly Thoreau responds to the Industrial Revolution with a sense that it is problematic. In Walden, Thoreau will argue that we need to simplify, that things can just as easily own us as we can own them. And you see him talking about the sustaining power of nature in direct response to the Industrial Revolution. And we know that Thoreau and Emerson in particular were a direct influence on John Muir. You wouldn't have the American National Park System, which John Muir initiated, without those two writers, especially those transcendentalists. And we know that Muir is a foundational figure in early modern or early environmental sensibilities. So that's, I think, the birth of it.
And in the case of McCarthy, of course, we've talked about how The Road is, in a way, a direct response, right, to these concerns. But is there anything else that we can see in his novels when it comes to this environmental consciousness?
Well, the first thing we see, there's a certain objectivity to McCarthy. He again, is not overt in any kind of political program or agenda. But what he does is he renders even the most harsh natural landscapes with a tremendous beauty. And he clearly, whether it's the forests, the deep forests of Appalachia, or it's the desert landscapes of Texas and the Southwest, he renders them with such care and such intensity and respect that it's impossible to think that he wouldn't be sensitive to their decimation. So simply in that, I would place him in the tradition of more of Melville, because he's a religious seeker and he's not certain of the truth of any kind of religious position. But in Moby Dick, there's a scene where the main character Ishmael sees a pod of whales. And this is a novel about whaling and where they're destroying the whales. And the ship is a kind of industrial space itself where you render the whales into oil. It's a kind of factory. But at this particular moment, Melville, through Ishmael, points to this pod of whales as these newborn whales are suckling on their mothers. And he embodies it with such beauty, and he personifies them as he sees them looking out and through him into an immortal space. So that's the sense, with a certain guarded respect for nature, not so much a guarded respect for nature, but a love of nature that is not bound to a political program. I place McCarthy in that tradition, although I think he's was quietly politically committed to sustainability. We know that.
I have one more question, and it comes from a pretty personal place. Because when reading McCarthy, we can get an impression that it's a very male-centric literature. It has a certain masculine sensibility. And I think it would be also difficult to expect from a man who was born in the first half of the 20th century to have a different sensibility. But as I'm saying, I'm talking from a perspective of a woman, obviously. I wasn't really drawn also to his work until I was in my mid-20s. And because his books seem catered towards a male audience, also aesthetically when you look at the covers. But yet, the themes that he's writing about are so universal. And I am also interested in these themes of, good versus evil and this dichotomy and maybe religion, interested in asking philosophical questions. So I'm not sure what I'm asking, to be honest. I'm just thinking, maybe, do you have a response to that?
First of all, he can be taken to task for his representation of women.
Right. That's another thing.
Yeah, some people have. Not so much his unfair or inaccurate representation of them so much as the fact that he doesn't deal with them much. Now, he himself says in the Oprah interview, he said he's asked that very question, and he says that he doesn't understand women. Now, I respect his honesty in that regard. I think he's being genuine there. But I'm also not entirely certain what that means. Right? In other words, gender is a contested concept. What it means to have a feminine sensibility or a masculine sensibility is at least challengeable. Right? The world of horses, for example, in the United States is dominated by women, right? Even though they don't figure in his novels so much, right? So Nell Sullivan has actually done a lot of work on gender in McCarthy. And I think that her work better answers your question because she deals with the representation of women. But I think in the end, I think the reason there are many. I was president of the Cormac McCarthy Society for almost 15 years, and I decided it was somebody else's turn, and I handed it over to my vice president, Stacy Peebles at Center College, and the current vice president is Lydia Cooper, and there are many others. So what is it about the fact that he's really drawing an audience of women and a scholarly audience of women? And I think that my speculation, and I don't feel strongly about this, is he's just not all that preoccupied with gender. He writes about what he knows and about his own experience. And it turns out that what he manages, I think, to communicate once we sort of penetrate the veil of men working and men on horseback or men doing this and men doing that, is that ultimately what he's about are the philosophical questions, the fundamental questions that transcend gender. And that's why he does have, in the end, a great appeal to both genders.
I think I can accept that, that speculation. Thank you so much. Professor Steven Frye, thank you so much for this conversation. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
This was an episode of NeoTalk, the official podcast of the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Warsaw, recorded in the Radio Campus studio. Franek Wójcicki edited this episode, and the cover art is by Weronika Rosik. Please check out our show notes if you're interested in the books and other sources mentioned in this episode. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you have comments, questions, or suggestions for topics we could cover, email us. My name is Maria Usakowska. Thanks for listening.